We have your daughter, they said. Have 200 grand ready. Don't call the police or you'll get a dead body.
Mike Zhang's nightmare began at his home in China with a phone call last November. Fraudsters claimed to have kidnapped his 20-year-old daughter in Toronto. At the same time, those same fraudsters convinced her to go into hiding for her own safety, effectively cutting her off from all contact with her parents in China.
At least 3 students went into hiding while their families overseas received ransom calls.
The Zhangs demanded proof their daughter was alive before sending any money. Within a few days, she resurfaced.
The first thing my daughter said was, "Dad, please don't get upset. I am so embarrassed and ashamed." I was relieved to just hear her voice. I told her it was not her fault.
But the same scam happened to at least 2 other Chinese families, at least one of which paid the ransom. It's highlighting the lack of oversight for these young students once they arrive in Canada.
If you're going to accept people that young, you should put in place a system to support them and not just leave them on their own devices and say, well, their parents let them come, so.
Activists say various levels of government need to take responsibility for young foreign students. For the students, it also means overcoming cultural and linguistic barriers that might prevent them from coming forward. Reporter Lisa Shing was part of the CBC team investigating the story. And I'm joined now by Lisa. Lisa, let's talk about this, how you got inside this story and talking to this young girl's father. How did that work?
Well, it was a really tough one, John. Just to give a bit of context, I mean, these parents are thousands and thousands of kilometers away in a completely different country, operating under a completely different system, especially politically. So it took a lot of calls to the Chinese consulate, who was first in touch with these families when the kids first disappeared. And we went through them because we were cognizant of these political differences, systemic differences as well. They went to the families, told them what we wanted to do and why we wanted to speak to them. And only one of the parents, Mike, came forward, but he had a lot of stipulations. He didn't want to go on camera. It was only via the phone. And we only had that to work with. Now, what was also interesting was that the Chinese consulate, I was surprised they were so willing to help us. Usually, you know, the Chinese government is pretty closed off and pretty mum on a lot of things happening in Canada as well. But they were more than willing to step up, to put us in touch with these families. And that to me just went to show how much they cared about this story and how much they wanted to raise awareness, because this scam was happening to so many people.
Hundreds of thousands of Chinese students are in this country in search of educational opportunities, so presumably they're all potentially targets. So what were some of the other challenges you faced going forwards?
Well, like we mentioned, linguistics was a huge one. The parents obviously don't speak English, none of the ones we spoke with at least. And the students themselves, I mean, they've been in this country for 6 months, a year max. And I realized when doing some of these interviews, language was a huge barrier. We tried to do the interviews in English at first. It didn't quite work, so then had to switch to Mandarin. And that's when the emotions and the details of their struggle actually came out. Now, along with that, there were cultural barriers as well, John. What I mean by that is Chinese people they don't like to kick up a fuss, you know, they like to kind of fly under the radar. And when something goes wrong, they generally ask themselves, what could I have done to do things differently, to avoid a situation, instead of looking at possible systemic issues that we explored in the story. So when it came down to that, we really had to lay out very specifically what we were doing, why we wanted to do it, like I said, and almost convince them to speak with us and share their stories, because maybe some of that wasn't their own doing. So the cultural barrier I found was a tough one, and that's why a lot of these interviews ended up being long interviews where we had to really ease into the subject a little bit. So a lot of challenges there.
Trust, always important in good journalism, and perhaps even more so in this case. We've got time for one more quick question, and it's an interesting one because you published the story on CBC.ca, you did a video version, you did an online version, and you did a version in Chinese. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it was almost a natural choice, actually, because so many of these international students, they come from all over the world, but the majority of them are, in fact, from China. So it was a natural decision because I mentioned the language barrier that not only the parents have, but the students themselves. And it was encouraging, actually, to know and hear that once the story got published in Chinese, people were physically copying and pasting the Chinese version and sharing it on WeChat, which is kind of like the Chinese version of WhatsApp, and sharing it with their friends and family in mainland China, because we know our CBC site is not accessible in that country. So a lot of attention there.
So probably not the last time you'll be doing something like that.
Definitely not, John.
Thanks, Lisa.